the Apostle John, for his words of how he addressed problems of the time in the first century, how it applies to us today. Open our minds and our hearts to your word this morning, so that your Son can live through us, through thy Son's name. Amen. Last week, we were talking about prayer, and one of them was a person that a sin unto death. And Tad pointed out after class that we missed a little bit, and that is, we were not to pray for that person. And Tad, do you have any comments on that?
Other than if you have trouble identifying the sin that leads to death, and you're not supposed to pray for the person who's committing that sin, then you have trouble identifying who you should and should not pray for. So, it's a little bit of a dilemma if you want to adhere strictly to that teaching.
Right. And I thought it is a dilemma, identifying a person. And, we know people that might deny Christ's existence today, but then changes their mind. But evidently, here John is talking about somebody that just is going to flat out reject Jesus Christ. But then you say, well, don't pray for that person. And that is a dilemma in ours. I guess it might be how you pray for that person. Can you pray for that person that he sees the light, he changes? I don't know. But it does make a dilemma out of it. Thank you for bringing that up. This morning we're studying 1st and 2nd John. I'd like to go through a little bit of background because there's some issues going on with both of these that are very relevant to that time, and I want to make sure that we put it in a proper setting. Inspired, if we go back and start looking at inspired scripture, the earliest knowledge that we have is somewhere around 180, and it's called the Manchurian list, if you want to call it that. And there, this individual lists the letters and the books that were accepted at that time. And strangely enough, most of them were already in there, with the exception of about 5. All right, and we're going to cover some of those and the reason why we're in there. But at a very early time, if you take Paul's letters, they were circulated among the congregations. The Gospels were circulated. Right? Now, what was one of the criteria for accepting this as inspired writing? Why would you accept something as this is inspired? There was what? All right, now there were a witness of Jesus, which made him an apostle, right? So if they were written by an apostle, they were immediately accepted, all right? Now, there was another slight criteria that is if they were written under the supervision of an apostle, you might say. And we can put Luke in that category, all right? Luke traveled with Apostle Paul. He wrote his gospel. He wrote Acts, all right? But it's considered as inspired word. There was another part of the criteria that said that anything as written had to be compatible with what was already accepted. All right? It could not be way out here. And therefore, we ran into a problem with Revelation. And Revelation was one of the last books that was accepted because of its visionary, and they were concerned that, and probably rightfully so, that there could be various interpretations made to this. And sure enough, as you know today, there are various interpretations made to it. But the Gospels, Acts, was very early accepted. Ones that came into question was Hebrews, because it was anonymous. Who wrote Hebrews? We still talk about that today. Any guess to why they picked the Apostle Paul as the writer of Hebrews? So it'd be accepted, exactly. They didn't know who wrote it, but they wanted it in. And it fit all the criteria, but they didn't know who wrote it, so they assigned Apostle Paul as an initial author so that everybody would accept it. James was also held off for a while. Why would that be? What does James highlight? Works. You know, if Romans, Paul's writing, talks about faith, how you're saved by faith through grace. James comes along and talks about works. And they didn't, at first, a lot of people didn't think that was compatible with the rest. And obviously, if you really then get into what James is talking about, it is. But it has that works veneer to it. 2 Peter was the most questioned one, and was probably more questions about it. Matter of fact, if I would go to William Barclay, and he'll say right up front that he doesn't believe that this should be in there. And mainly because they didn't think Peter wrote it. They thought somebody else wrote it. It has a different style than 1 Peter. But eventually they come around and said, okay, this is the way it was. And why are we covering some of this? 2nd and 3rd John was not in some of the original list. And again, why would 2nd and 3rd John may not be? Pardon? The address is different? Who does he say wrote? Who do we say wrote 2nd, 3rd John? What's in there? Very first verse.
Chosen lady and Gaius.
All right, it's to the chosen lady, all right, and to Gaius, all right, but who wrote it? The elder? Yeah, it says the elder. It doesn't say John the Apostle. It says the elder wrote it. And therefore, there was some concern, did John really write this? Well, if you look at the content of it, the content is just so similar to 1 John, you know, that you have to think that and come to the conclusion that John wrote these. And then again, Revelation, there was some questions about Jude and then Revelation. But again, by the early 300s, all this was put to rest. And we have the canon as we know it today, the 27 books or letters of the New Testament. Now, let's look at what occurred since we did not have all the writings, and we did not have this book that we call the Bible, and we had passing around were the letters. How was the teaching done? How were they able to stay on a particular doctrine during a high growth of the church? And of course, we start out with the 12 apostles. Inspired people. People accepted their teaching. Did they have a limitation as far as their coverage, a geographical area? Not really, did they? They were global. They could go anywhere they want because they were inspired of God. But then, so you come back then to what is the next level of teaching, and let's look at Titus 1, 5, and 6. Who has that? All right, good.
I left you on the island of Crete. I did this because there were some things that hadn't been finished. I wanted you to put them in order. I also wanted you to appoint elders in every town
So here we see he wanted him to appoint elders where? In every city. Now, we take elders as a congregational, all right? If you look in the early times, where did the congregations meet? Homes, all right? They were small groups. You could not have elders in every one of those homes. You very likely not have enough qualified people to meet in a home. So therefore, the elders attack over a city and they overlook the various home congregations. Might be 6 or 8 meeting here, 10 over there, and 15 here, and they oversaw that. And whether it is an elder or called a bishop, and we see the bishop picked up very early on, it's all the shepherd, they're all the same. Even Peter was an elder appointed. Therefore, I exhort you, the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that be revealed, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight. And then we see Paul talking to the elders of Ephesus at Miletus. Let's look at Acts chapter 20. Who has that? All right, good, Mark.
20, 17, and 18. From Miletus he sent to Ephesus, and called to him the elders of the church. And when they had come to him, he said to them, "You yourselves know from the first day that I set foot in Asia, how I was with you the whole time." Verse 28. "Keep a guard for yourselves and for all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God which he purchased with his own blood. I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come among you, not sparing the flock. From among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things, and draw away the disciples after them."
Very good, thank you. So here Paul's warning them that there's going to be people coming in and not teaching the truth. We're going to see that in verses or 2nd for John. Now the elders then had a local responsibility. They were in charge of a city of small congregations. You didn't have an elder from Athens go to Rome and tell them what they're doing. They were at Athens, or they were at Corinth, or they were in Ephesus, all right? In a town overseeing the family churches. All right, but it didn't stop there, did it? Let's look at 1 Corinthians 12:28. Who has that? Oh, okay.
And God had set some in the church, first apostles, secondly prophets, thirdly teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, governments, diverse kinds of tongues.
So here we see Paul, this was a whole list of spiritual gifts that was given out. But Paul says there were some in the church. There was first apostles, second was prophets, and then third teachers. So we run into the term prophet. Now we think of a prophet sometimes as somebody that is foretelling the future. But that's not really the prophet of the early church. A prophet is somebody that is just revealing truth. And prophets had, again, they traveled. In the early church, they traveled from congregation to congregation. They were not limited to one congregation. They would consider them kind of like traveling ministers. It's interesting that, and I'm not too good on my dictation, but I think Diache, the teaching of the 12, was an early kind of handbook that the church would give out to people to say, this is what we believe. This is how you should be living your life. And it goes into detail of fornication, this and that and the other. It goes into detail of baptism. It goes into detail on the Lord's Supper. But it also goes into how you deal with prophets. And those people that are coming into your congregation and teaching the word. And one of the things it tells them, they only are supposed to stay there 3 days. If they stay longer than 3 days, they're a false prophet. If they ask you for money, they are a false prophet. Now, in another section, it tells them that they are to feed them when they come in, but it's supposed to be voluntarily fed, and you're supposed to give them enough food that they go on to their next location. But it's, again, this was written in the 2nd century. And you can see what is going on with the church at that time of the prophets, and it fits into 2nd and 3rd John, because when was 2nd and 3rd John written? Remember? 95? 95 to 100 late. All right, that's right at the cusp of going into the next century. So John was writing, this was written about maybe 80 years after John wrote this. All right, so with that, we're going to read both 2nd John and 3rd John, and they're both relatively short, and want to look at similarities that you see in them. All right, who has 2nd John? Good, Danny.
The elder, the lady chosen by God, and her children, whom I love in the truth. Not I only, but also all who love the truth, know the truth. Because the truth, which lives in us, will be with us forever. Grace and mercy and peace from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, will be with us in truth and love. It has given me great joy to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as the Father commanded us. Now, dear lady, I am not writing to you a new command, but one we had from the beginning. I ask that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk in obedience to His commands. As you heard from the beginning, His command is that you walk in love. I say this because many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch out that you do not lose what we have worked for, but that you may be rewarded fully. Anyone who runs ahead and does not continue in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever continues in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not take them into your house or welcome them. Anyone who welcomes them shares in their wicked work. I have much to write to you, but I don't want to use pen and paper. Instead, I hope to visit you and talk face to face, so that our joy may be complete. The children of your sister, who was chosen by God, send their greeting.
Thank you. And now, 3rd John, who has that?
The elder, to my dear friend Gaius, whom I love and true. Dear friend, I pray that you may be in good health, and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting on well. It gave me great joy when some believers came and testified about your faithfulness to the truth, showing how you continue to walk in it. I have no greater joy than to hear that the children are walking in the truth. Dear friend, you are faithful in what you're doing for your brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers. They have told the church about you. Please send them on their way in a manner that honors God. It was for the sake of the name that they went out receiving no help from the pagans. We ought therefore to show hospitality to such people, so that we may work together for the church. I wrote to the church, but rather Chucky, who loves me first, will not welcome us. So when I come, I will call attention to what he is doing, spreading malicious nonsense about us.
again, let's go back. Who does he say wrote this? The elder. Now, you could assume that that's a bishop, but again, this is one of the quandaries of the early one, is why didn't he say apostle? Well, Mark indicated, he was 95 years old or so at the time, in the late 90s when he wrote this, so he could be just being, I don't know about you, but I look at people 70 anymore as young, and if you're 90, you look at about anybody that is, they're young people. This is a sidelight, but I remember I was raised in a 3-room schoolhouse. Mrs. McClellan taught our first, second, and third grade class. And Mrs. McClellan was always vision her as this elderly lady, and very matronly. Well, about 3 months ago, in clearing out, I found a picture of our classroom. Mrs. McClellan wasn't over 35 years old. And so, when you're a kid, anybody up there, 35, they look elderly. When you get to my age, everybody's kids, all right? But I think John was probably talking about that. I am the elder talking to you. I'm the older person here. Now, I thought the strange thing was at the closing of both of them, what did he say?
I want to see you face to face.
Was that?
He wants to see them face to face.
Yeah, I want to see you face to face. I mean, a man that is his age, been exiled on Isle of Patmos. He was traveled with Jesus. Well, I won't get into that quite. But he's been through that much and is that late stage in his life. And he still, I want to come and see you. It kind of puts out, there's not a retirement for a Christian. You don't hit a Christian retirement age. But I thought that in both letters, that's what he said. Now let's look at to whom they were written. Who was second John written to? Pardon? The chosen lady and her children. Or one of them said the elect lady. All right, who could that be? Rudy, you got any thoughts? That would be you could say that it was written to a particular person, a lady, but I would think that it's a term he was using for the church. So a particular church, and her children, the members of that church. Jesus being the bride, so church being the bride. So that's a general feeling. It was written to a particular church. Now, second one was written to whom? Or third John was written to whom? Gaius. Any idea who Gaius was? Is Tara?
It's in 1 Corinthians, he's mentioned that Paul baptized Gaius.
All right, and I even had 1 Corinthians. Somebody got 1 Corinthians? No? Okay. But, do you have it?
I will.
All right, 1 Corinthians 11.
Find it and see it. 1 Corinthians 11. For it has been declared to me concerning you, my brethren, by those of Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you. Now I say this, that each of you says, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, or I'm of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Christ crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I've baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius.
All right, so now we see Gaius, this particular Gaius is in Corinth. Thank you, Carrie. Let's look at Romans 16. Who has Romans 16? Very good.
Gaius, whose hospitality I and the whole church here to go send you his greeting. Erastus, who is the city's director of public works, and our brother Quartus send you their greeting.
All right, in this particular case, this is Romans. Paul wrote Romans from Corinth. And there he says, as he writes to the church at Rome, that Gaius is having people into his house. He has a small group meeting in his house. So this is an assumption, because bear in mind, at this time there were not second. You did not have family names. So Gaius was a widely used name, just like Jesus was at the time. But it seems like Gaius keeps coming up a lot. All right, and so here we feel that this is the Gaius that Paul baptized was living at Corinth. And he was a member of the church, and John was encouraging him in his work. Now let's look a little bit in 2 John. What's the feeling of the church that he was writing to? What kind of a condition was it in? I find some of your children walking in the truth. So he's talking about a church that is actively walking in the church. They were faithful, but they were being visited by those that maybe might mix leavening in with the truth. I think it's also, this is where you see John being so consistent in his gospel in 1 John and 2 John. Here he's talking about people coming in and putting leaven in the truth, and because these are traveling people coming through, he will identify them as the Antichrist even. But then he throws in, now I ask you, lady, not as though I were writing to you a new commandment, but the one in which we have had from the beginning, that you love one another. He is trying to show love and treat everybody with love, including those. You're supposed to love the individual that is maybe trying to hurt you, maybe trying to show this disruption within the church. Now that doesn't mean that you don't discipline them and you don't point out. Again, just like your child, you love your child, but you're going to discipline because you love them. So, but it should be, everything you do should be done with love. Easier said than done. All right, so the threat here in 2 John was a traveling salesman, I put it that way, for many deceivers have gone out of the world, those who do not acknowledge that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. So he is instructing them to be aware of this and to be a knowledge of the Antichrist again. And this was, so he's dealing with 2 John, very similar things that he was dealing with 1 John. And again, what we're seeing is the activity of the early church, where the prophets and teachers were going from town to town to town. And they had to be aware of what are they teaching? Are they teaching what you've been taught from the beginning? Now, we have an interesting one in 3 John, who is, Mark, you pronounce his name better than me. That sounds good to me. I'll take that one. All right, who was he? Anybody? I mean, he was a person in the church. Let's talk about what was he doing that John was conveying to Gaius about?
He seems to be conceited.
Pardon?
He seems to be conceited.
He's very conceited. You were supposed to, when these prophets come in, you were supposed to accept them, give them hospitality. And if you come back to one of the criteria of an elder is for them to be hospitable. Well, that was a major term at this time because you did have various teachers coming into the church and they were supposed to be hospitable to them, all right? He was not hospitable. Not only did he not take care of the people that came in, but if somebody else did, what did he do? He kicked them out. He disciplined them. All right? Now, I thought it was interesting that John actually wrote a letter, they said, to this church, a letter that we don't have. And bear in mind, we only have 2 letters to 1 Corinthians, and we know there's 4 that was written, and maybe the 5th one. And we do not have copies of those. So the apostles wrote other letters that we don't have, and here John had written a letter to the church, and he didn't accept that teaching. I'm sitting here saying, here is a man that walked in the steps of Jesus, was taught by Jesus, was there at the cross, at the trial of Jesus, was at the bottom of the cross of Jesus, accepted the fact that he will take care of Jesus' mother. He was so faithful in that the mission had him exiled to the Isle of Patmos. And then he comes out and he's writing this letter. And this guy says, that takes, I don't know. Now, the question is, was he an elder? And we don't have an acknowledgement of that. He's almost, it appears that he's acting like one, but we don't know for sure whether he was or not. But John is writing to Gaius now to tell him, to try to tell him how to deal with this person. Okay? Now, who is the other character that comes along? Demetrius. Now, who do we think Demetrius is? Danny? Hi. Hey, wait, Danny is delegating that question to you. Yeah, that's the reason why Danny's a good manager in his company, right? He knows how to delegate. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, there's some thought here that he might be the postman of this letter. But he's considered as a traveling, or a prophet. And Gaius is saying this guy has a good reputation, and to accept him, accept what he is doing, and you're going to fight against the other gentleman, but don't worry about it. When I get there, I'm going to talk to him. I'm going to get him in his place. So he's putting Gaius in a position of making sure that Demetrius is accepted, because Demetrius is teaching the truth. And John is telling him that trust Demetrius. He is fine. Right? Yeah, and he is maybe the traveling person that's carrying the letter. You think about the Diothropos, whatever his name is. I'm sorry, I'm not good at names. But in 1 Timothy 3:6, when Paul is telling Timothy to establish elders, what's one of the criteria of an elder? Hospitable? Pardon?
Teach the word.
Speak the word? Yeah? Right. That he's not so young that he gets into himself. Right? He's older and therefore he's already got his self-image. He already is his own person. He doesn't have to be infatuated. And I'm looking at, this guy seems to fit that category. Maybe he was an elder too young in life. I don't know that. Yes?
So I think about a word is that too young is also not too new in the faith, which, but sometimes you meet someone who's new in the faith and it's refreshing how vigorous they are about it. But there's that risk, I guess, on the other side.
Yes. You have young in age, you also have young in the faith. Yes. And you're right. As you're young, you're a lot of times very excited, and then you wear down later on. And you may get excited about the wrong things. Yes. Libby? It's time to, yeah. We have greeting duty this morning, so excuse me. All right. All right, any comments over what we've had? So if I had to try to summarize the two messages that were conveyed to Gaius, accept Demetrius that's coming because he's received a good testimony from others, and do not let the other guy refuse his message. And then, even with the scourge of the other guy, do not imitate what is evil. All right? But do not imitate evil with evil, but imitate evil, do good. So here you see this guy that's doing evil, but don't let him suck you in to doing evil back to him. Love him, do what is best for him, and do good. It is so easy to, within the church and within our family, anybody, if somebody is hurting you, calling you out, to respond in a negative way. But Paul tells the Romans that God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, say the Lord. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of burning coals on his head. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Similar message that John is saying right here. Any additional comments on our study or anything like that? All right, next week, we'll have coffee and conversation. And I can say I only hope that you learn as much about the early church and the Apostle John and his during this study as I did. And I just want to say, may God bless you in the studies of his word. Thank you.